I didn't notice the silence at first. It took a few days before I realized the apartment sounded different. Not louder, not quieter, just wrong. Like something had been removed that I couldn't name, but my body kept reaching for it anyway. There used to be this small routine we had. Nothing important. Just the way the evening settled. The same low background noise, the same shared space without needing to talk. I never thought about it while it was happening. It was just there. Now it isn't. I still catch myself pausing in the doorway sometimes, like I'm waiting for something to resume. Like I forgot to press play. But there's nothing coming back. I left without making a scene. No shouting, no final argument, no moment where everything exploded and forced a clean ending. I packed what I needed, closed the door behind me, and decided I wouldn't be the kind of person who stays and asks questions that don't have answers. At the time, that felt like control. Now I'm not so sure. Because when you leave like that, quietly, you don't actually take anything with you. Not clarity. Not closure. Just distance. And distance doesn't fix what you don't understand. There's this version of me that existed before all of this. Someone who didn't think twice about trust. Someone who didn't feel the need to double-check the tone behind a simple sentence or wonder what wasn't being said. I don't know exactly when that version of me disappeared. I just know I'm not him anymore. What makes it worse is that there wasn't a moment where everything broke in a way I could point to. No single event that felt big enough to justify what came after. It started smaller than that. So small, I almost ignored it. I remember the feeling more than the detail. That slight shift, like something slipping out of place. Not enough to alarm me, just enough to make me pause. I told myself it was nothing. It didn't even register as doubt at the time, just a brief hesitation before everything went back to normal. Except it didn't really go back. Something stayed with me after that. Quiet, persistent. Not loud enough to confront, but not easy enough to forget. I kept moving forward like everything was fine. Like whatever I felt didn't matter. And for a while, that worked. Or at least, it looked like it did. But there's a point where ignoring something becomes its own kind of decision. And I crossed that point without realizing it. Looking back, I think that's the moment everything actually changed. Not when I left. Not when I understood what had happened. But when I noticed something I couldn't explain, and chose to carry on anyway. Because once you see even the smallest crack, you don't really unsee it. You just learn how to look around it. Until one day, you can't anymore. And by then, whatever was holding everything together, already isn't. If you're listening to this and you've ever had that feeling, that quiet moment where something didn't sit right but you pushed it aside, I want to know what you did next. Did you trust it, or did you ignore it like I did? Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who's been through something similar. Because sometimes, the story doesn't start with betrayal. Sometimes, it starts with something so small, you almost miss it. If you had asked me back then whether something like this could happen to us, I would have said no without even thinking about it. Not in a defensive way. Just, certain. We weren't the kind of people who needed to prove anything. There was no constant checking in, no suspicion, no reason to question where the other person stood. Things felt steady. Predictable in a way that didn't feel boring, just safe. I trusted her in a way I didn't really notice at the time. It wasn't something I actively thought about. It showed up in small things. Leaving my phone face down without worrying. Not needing explanations for where she'd been or who she'd talked to. Assuming that whatever she said was the full truth, because why wouldn't it be? There was no tension around it. We had our own rhythms. Not routines exactly, just habits that formed over time. The way conversations would drift in and out without effort. The way silence didn't feel like distance. We could sit in the same space, doing completely different things, and it still felt like we were connected. That was the part one relied on the most. She was the person I went to without thinking. If something good happened, she was the first one I wanted to tell. If something went wrong, I didn't hesitate. There was this unspoken understanding that she'd be there, not to fix things, just to be present. And she was. At least, that's how I remember it. There were no major cracks. No obvious signs that something was off. If anything, I probably would have described us as solid. Not perfect, but stable in a way that made everything else feel manageable. I built a lot of my life around that stability. Looking back, I think I tied more of myself to the relationship than I realized. Not in a dependent way, at least I didn't think so then, but in how much I assumed it would always be there. It felt permanent. Not because we said it out loud, but because nothing ever suggested otherwise. There was no reason to imagine things falling apart. No big arguments, no moments where I questioned whether we were actually working. Even when things weren't ideal, it felt normal. The kind of imperfections you expect in any relationship. Small misunderstandings. Occasional distance when one of us was stressed or distracted. Nothing that stood out. And that's what made it so easy to believe in what we had. I didn't analyze it. I didn't step back and ask whether everything was really as strong as it felt. I just accepted it as part of my life, like something that had already proven itself. She wasn't just someone I was with. She was part of how I understood things. Part of how I measured stability, consistency, even trust itself. If something didn't make sense in my life, I'd bring it to her. If I felt unsure, I'd talk it through with her. She had this way of grounding things, making everything feel less complicated. I never questioned her intentions. That might have been the biggest thing. Not once did it cross my mind that she could be hiding something significant. Not once did I feel the need to check, to verify, or to doubt. The idea of betrayal didn't fit anywhere in how I saw her, or us. It wasn't even a possibility I entertained. There were moments, small ones, where she seemed distracted. Times when she'd pull away slightly, like her attention was somewhere else. But I didn't think much of it. Everyone has those moments. I told myself she was tired. Busy. Dealing with something I didn't fully understand. And I left it at that. Because that's what trust looked like to me back then. Not questioning. Not digging deeper. Just accepting what was in front of me and believing it was enough. I didn't feel like I was ignoring anything. I felt like I was doing the right thing. And for a long time, that belief held everything together. Or at least, that's what I thought. It didn't change all at once. If it had, I think I would have noticed sooner. There would have been something clear to react to. Something I could point at and say, this is different. But that's not how it happened. It was more like things started slipping slightly out of sync. Not enough to break anything. Just enough to feel off. At first, it showed up in small ways. Conversations that didn't land the same. Responses that felt a little delayed, like she was somewhere else even when she was right in front of me. I remember asking her once if everything was okay. She said, yeah. Just tired. And that made sense. So I left it there. That became the pattern. I'd notice something, bring it up lightly, and she'd give an answer that sounded reasonable. Not defensive. Not dismissive. Just enough to close the moment. And I let it close. There were times when she'd be on her phone longer than usual. Not hiding it exactly, just, more absorbed. I'd catch myself watching for a second too long, then look away like I was the one doing something wrong. I told myself it didn't matter. People get distracted. People have things going on that aren't about you. That's what I kept repeating. Even when it started happening more often. There was one evening I remember clearly, not because anything big happened, but because of how normal it looked from the outside. We were sitting in the same room, doing our own things. That kind of quiet we were used to. But it didn't feel the same. I couldn't explain why. Nothing was wrong. No argument. No tension. Just this strange sense that I wasn't fully there with her anymore. Like I was sitting next to someone who was already somewhere else. I almost said something. But then I stopped myself. Because what would I even say? There was nothing concrete. Just a feeling. And feelings aren't proof. So I ignored it. That's the part one keep coming back to now, the number of times I chose not to follow that instinct. It wasn't just once. It kept happening. Little moments where something didn't line up. A shift in tone. A delay in response. A kind of distance that didn't have a clear reason behind it. And every time, I found a way to explain it. Work stress. Fatigue. My own overthinking. Anything but the possibility that something was actually wrong. I think part of me didn't want to know. Because the version of us I believed in didn't include doubt. If I started questioning things, even quietly, it would change how I saw everything. So I stayed in that space where things were almost normal. Close enough to ignore. There were also moments where she seemed more attentive than usual. Almost like she was compensating for something I hadn't fully noticed yet. That confused me more than anything. Because it gave me just enough reassurance to cancel out the discomfort. I'd think, see, everything's fine, and push the earlier feeling aside. It became this cycle. Notice something. Question it briefly. Find a reason to dismiss it. Move on. Until the next time. I never confronted anything directly. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't feel justified. There was always that voice telling me I was reading too much into things. And I trusted that voice. More than I trusted the feeling. Looking back, I can see how gradual it was. How nothing on its own would have been enough to raise concern. But together, they were building something I didn't want to recognize. A kind of quiet distance that kept growing without ever announcing itself. I started to feel it in the way we spoke. Conversations that used to flow easily now had small gaps. Moments where I'd say something and it wouldn't quite land the way it used to. She still responded. Still engaged. But it felt thinner somehow. Like something underneath had shifted. I didn't have the language for it at the time. All I knew was that things didn't feel as solid as they used to. And instead of leaning into that, I pulled back. Not visibly. Not in a way that would start a conversation. Just internally. I stopped asking certain questions. Stopped paying attention to certain details. Not consciously, but enough to keep things smooth on the surface. Because as long as nothing was openly wrong, I could keep believing everything was still intact. That's what I told myself. That things don't just fall apart without a reason. That if something serious was happening, I'd know. It would be obvious. It wouldn't look like this. Quiet. Subtle. Easy to ignore. I didn't understand yet that sometimes, the most important changes are the ones that don't feel wrong enough to confront. And by the time they do, you've already adjusted to them. It didn't happen the way I thought it would. There was no dramatic discovery. No moment where everything lined up perfectly and forced a reaction. No undeniable proof that demanded an immediate confrontation. It was quieter than that. Almost ordinary. I remember where I was, but not in a way that matters. What stayed with me wasn't the setting, it was the feeling. That same feeling I'd been ignoring for weeks, maybe longer. Only this time, it didn't pass. It settled. There was something small. Something I wasn't meant to notice, or maybe something I wouldn't have noticed before all those other moments started adding up. A detail that didn't match the version of things I had in my head. At first, I tried to fit it into place. I told myself there was a simple explanation. That I was missing context. That I didn't have the full picture. But the more I looked at it, the less it made sense. And that's when everything shifted. Not outwardly. Nothing changed in the room. Nothing about her behavior suddenly gave it away. She was still the same person in front of me. Still speaking the same way. Still moving through the same space like nothing was different. But inside my head, something locked into place. It wasn't certainty right away. It was recognition. That slow, heavy realization that you've been seeing pieces of something for a while, and now they've finally connected. I didn't say anything. That's the part people always expect to be different. They think this is where the confrontation happens. Where you demand answers, where everything comes out at once. But I didn't. I just sat with it. I watched her move through the rest of the day like nothing had changed, and I realized something that felt almost worse than the betrayal itself. She didn't know that I knew. And for a brief moment, I understood both sides of that. The version of her that believed everything was still hidden. And the version of me that couldn't unknow what I'd just seen. That gap between those two realities, that's where everything broke. Because once you're in that space, there's no going back to how things felt before. Even if you don't speak, even if nothing is said out loud, something fundamental has already shifted. I started replaying things in my head. Not obsessively at first. Just small moments. Conversations that didn't quite make sense at the time. The distance I couldn't explain. The times she seemed present, but not really there. Now they felt different. Not suspicious, confirmed. That's what changed the most. Before, everything had a reasonable explanation. Now, everything had a different one. And the more I let myself think about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't something recent. It hadn't just started. It had been building, quietly, while I was still moving through the relationship like everything was intact. That realization didn't make me angry right away. It made me still. I remember sitting there, not reacting, not asking questions, not even showing that anything had changed. Just processing. Trying to figure out what this meant. Not just about her, but about everything I thought I understood. Because if this could exist underneath what we had, then what exactly had I been trusting? That question stayed with me longer than anything else. I didn't need to see more. I didn't need confirmation in the way people usually talk about it. There wasn't a need to gather evidence or build a case. I already knew enough. Not every detail. Not every timeline. But enough to understand the truth behind it. And that was the hardest part. Because when you don't have all the answers, your mind fills in the rest. Not with facts, but with possibilities. And those possibilities, they don't leave much room for doubt. I think a part of me was waiting to feel something stronger. Anger. Hurt. Some kind of emotional reaction that would push me into action. But it didn't come like that. What I felt was clarity. Cold, steady clarity. The kind that doesn't rush you, doesn't overwhelm you, it just sits there and refuses to move. And in that clarity, I understood something I hadn't been ready to accept before. Whatever this was, it wasn't something I could fix by asking the right questions. It wasn't something that had just happened once and could be explained away. It was a choice. Maybe more than one. And that realization stripped away the last part of me that wanted to hold on to the version of us I believed in. I didn't confront her that day. I didn't even hint that anything had changed. Because I knew that once I said it out loud, everything would become real in a different way. It would force a conversation I wasn't ready to have yet. And more importantly, it would give her a chance to explain. I wasn't sure I wanted that. Not yet. So I waited. Not for proof. But for myself to fully accept what I already knew. If you've ever been in that position, where you don't have a full confession, but you know enough to feel it in your gut, you understand how strange that space is. It's not about evidence. It's about recognition. About the moment something clicks, and you realize the story you've been living in isn't the real one. If that's something you've experienced, take a second to pause here. Would you have said something immediately? Or would you have done what I did, and stayed quiet just a little longer? If this kind of story hits close to home, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who's been through something similar. Because sometimes, the hardest part isn't finding out the truth. It's deciding what to do once you already know it. I carried that realization with me for longer than I expected. Long enough for it to settle into something permanent. And once it did, there was only one decision left to make. I just needed to be sure I was ready to live with it. I didn't leave right away. That's the part one don't usually admit out loud. Not because I was unsure of what I'd seen, but because I needed time to understand what it meant for me. Not for us, for me. What staying would say about me. What leaving would cost me. So I moved through those next few days like everything was still normal. I spoke the same way. Responded the same way. Sat in the same spaces we always did. If she noticed anything different, she didn't say it. Or maybe she didn't notice at all. That thought crossed my mind more than once. That everything could feel this different to me, and not register the same way for her. It made things quieter between us, even when we were talking. I started paying attention in a different way. Not searching for more evidence, just observing. Watching how easily everything continued. How natural it all looked from the outside. There was no urgency from her side. No shift that suggested she felt anything slipping. And that, more than anything, made the decision clearer. Because I realized something I hadn't fully accepted yet. I was the only one living in this new version of reality. She was still in the old one. And I couldn't stay there with her. When I finally decided to leave, it didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel like a breaking point or some emotional climax. It felt quiet. Like something had already ended, and I was just catching up to it. I didn't plan a speech. I didn't rehearse what I would say. I didn't go over scenarios in my head about how the conversation might go. Because I wasn't looking for a conversation. I was looking for distance. I packed slowly. Not everything. Just what I needed to get through the next stretch of time. Clothes. A few personal things. The essentials. It felt strange, deciding what counted as essential. What part of your life do you take when you're not sure if you're coming back? I avoided anything that would turn the moment into something heavier than it already was. No sentimental items. No unnecessary reminders. Just enough to leave. She was there when I told her. I kept it simple. I think I need some space. That's what I said. Not an accusation. Not a question. Just a statement. She looked at me for a second, like she was trying to understand what I meant beyond the words themselves. Okay, she said. That was it. No immediate pushback. No panic. No attempt to stop me or pull me into a deeper explanation. Just acceptance. And I didn't know what to do with that. Part of me expected resistance. Even just a little. A question, maybe. Something that would make me explain myself more clearly. But she didn't ask. She didn't say, why. She didn't say, what happened. She didn't even try to fill the silence that followed. And in that moment, something inside me shifted again. Because I realized I wasn't leaving a fight. I was leaving something that had already gone quiet. I picked up my bag, moved toward the door, and paused for a second, not because I was unsure, but because it felt like I should feel something stronger. Something final. But all I felt was, steady. Like the decision had already been made long before I stood there. "I'll be in touch," I said. She nodded. That was the last thing we said to each other before I walked out. No slammed doors. No raised voices. No moment that would make the story easier to tell later. Just a clean exit. And somehow, that made it heavier. Because there was nothing to push against. No anger to carry with me. No argument to justify the distance. Just silence. The first night away felt different than I expected. I thought I'd feel relief. Or maybe regret. Instead, it felt empty. Not in a dramatic way. Just, open. Too much space. Too much quiet. I kept reaching for my phone out of habit. Thinking about saying something, then stopping myself. Because I didn't want to fall back into the same pattern. I didn't want to ask questions I already knew the answer to. So I sat with it. The distance. The silence. The absence of everything that used to feel normal. And that's when it really started to sink in. Leaving doesn't give you clarity. It just removes the distraction. All the noise that kept you from fully feeling what was already there, it's gone. And what's left is just you, and the truth you didn't want to face. I told myself I did the right thing. That walking away without begging, without forcing a confrontation, was the strongest choice I could make. And maybe it was. But strength doesn't make it easier. It just makes it quieter. And in that quiet, I started to realize something I hadn't fully prepared for. Distance doesn't end the story. It just changes where it continues. We didn't cut contact. That surprised me. I thought leaving would create a clean break. That distance would naturally turn into silence, and silence would make everything easier to process. But that's not what happened. A few days passed before we spoke again. It wasn't planned. Just a message, simple, neutral. "Are you okay?" I stared at it longer than I expected to. There were a lot of ways I could have answered that. Most of them honest. None of them simple. "I'm fine," I wrote back. It wasn't true, but it was easier than explaining why it wasn't. That's how it started. Short messages at first. Then longer ones. Eventually, calls. Not emotional at the beginning. Just, controlled. Careful. Like we were both trying to figure out how to talk without breaking something further. The first real conversation happened a few days later. I remember sitting there, knowing this was the moment where things could finally be said out loud. Where I could ask everything I'd been holding back. But when the time came, I didn't start with accusations. I just said, "I know." There was a pause on the other end. Not confusion. Not denial. Just, silence. And that silence told me more than anything she could have said. "I figured," she replied after a moment. No attempt to redirect. No pretending she didn't understand what I meant. That alone caught me off guard. I expected resistance. Maybe defensiveness. Some version of "it's not what you think." But there was none of that. Instead, she let the conversation go where it needed to go. I asked questions. Not all at once. Not in some structured way. Just as they came to me. And she answered them. Directly. No hesitation, no trying to reshape the narrative into something easier to accept. She didn't minimize it. Didn't shift blame. Didn't try to make it about something I had done or hadn't done. That didn't make it easier to hear. If anything, it made it heavier. Because there was nothing to push against. No version of events I could reject or argue with. Just the truth, laid out without decoration. I remember asking, "Why didn't you say anything?" She took a second before answering. "I didn't know how to say it without breaking everything," she said. I didn't respond right away. Because in a way, that answer made sense. And I didn't want it to. We kept talking after that. Not just once. Not just to clear the air. It became something we returned to over and over again. Conversations that didn't fix anything, didn't resolve anything, but still felt necessary. I'd go into them thinking I'd finally reach some kind of clarity. That if I just asked the right question, I'd understand it in a way that would make it easier to process. But that never happened. Each answer led to another question. Each explanation opened up something else. And no matter how much we talked, there was always something left unsettled. I went through different phases during those conversations. At first, I was controlled. Measured. Trying to stay grounded in the facts. Then came the anger. Not explosive, not loud, but present. It would come out in small ways. In the tone of my voice. In the way I'd pause before responding. "You had so many chances to stop," I said once. "I know," she replied. No argument. No justification. Just acknowledgement. And somehow, that made it harder to hold on to the anger. Because anger needs resistance. It needs something to push against. And she wasn't giving me that. There were moments where I pulled back completely. Days where I didn't respond. Didn't pick up calls. Not to punish her, at least, that's not how I saw it, but because I needed distance from the conversations themselves. They were exhausting. Every time we spoke, it felt like reopening something that hadn't even started to close. And yet, I kept coming back to them. Because even though they didn't fix anything, they felt honest. That was the part one couldn't ignore. She wasn't trying to rush me. Wasn't asking for forgiveness. Wasn't setting expectations about where this should lead. At one point, I asked her directly, "What do you expect from this?" Another pause. "Nothing," she said. "I just want to answer whatever you need to ask." That stayed with me. Because it wasn't what I expected. I thought there would be some kind of underlying goal. A push toward reconciliation. A subtle pressure to move things forward. But there wasn't. She let the timeline sit entirely with me. Which meant I couldn't blame her for how long it was taking. I couldn't say I was being rushed or manipulated into a decision. Everything was open. And that openness forced me to sit with something I hadn't planned for. There was no clear direction. No moment where the conversations led to closure. Just a cycle of truth, reaction, and silence. Over and over again. And somewhere in that cycle, something started to shift, not in what had happened, not in how I felt about it, but in how I saw her in the middle of it. Not as someone defending a mistake. But as someone fully aware of what she'd done. Living in it. Not trying to escape it. That didn't change the damage. It didn't restore what was lost. But it complicated things in a way I hadn't expected. Because it meant this wasn't just about what she did. It was about what she did after. And I didn't know yet what to do with that. I didn't notice the shift right away. If anything, I resisted it. For a while, everything still felt the same on my side. The distance, the hesitation, the way I filtered every word she said before deciding how to respond. I wasn't trying to move forward. I wasn't trying to rebuild anything. I was just staying in it long enough to understand it. But somewhere in those conversations, something started to change. Not trust. That didn't come back. Not even close. If anything, I became more aware of how fragile it had always been. How easily it could exist on the surface while something else was happening underneath. So no, I didn't start trusting her again. But I stopped seeing her the same way I did when I first found out. That initial version of her, the one I built in my head after everything came together, was defined by the betrayal. That was the only lens I had. Everything she said, everything she did, it all ran through that. But the longer we talked, the harder it became to keep that version intact. Because she didn't behave the way I expected. There were no excuses. No attempts to soften what had happened. No subtle ways of shifting the focus away from her choices. If anything, she leaned into it. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that felt performative. Just, consistently. If I asked something difficult, she answered it. If I went quiet, she didn't chase the silence. If I came back with frustration, she didn't push back against it. She just stayed where she was. And at first, I didn't trust that either. It felt unnatural. Like there had to be something behind it. Some kind of strategy, even if I couldn't see it clearly. Because people don't usually sit in discomfort like that without trying to change it. But she did. Over and over again. There was one moment that stuck with me. I had asked her something I'd already asked before. Not because I needed the answer again, but because I was still trying to understand it in a different way. She paused, then said, "I know I've said this already, but I'll say it again if you need me to." No frustration. No sign that she was tired of going in circles. Just patience. And that's when it started to register. Not as forgiveness. Not even as acceptance. But as something I didn't expect to feel again. Respect. Not for what she did. But for how she was handling what came after. That distinction mattered more than I thought it would. Because it didn't erase anything. It didn't make the situation easier. If anything, it made it more complicated. It would have been simpler if she had denied it. If she had argued, deflected, given me something to push against. I could have held on to that. Used it as a reason to walk away without looking back. But she didn't give me that version. She gave me something harder to process. Consistency. Accountability. And time. All without asking for anything in return. That's what started to shift things. Not in a way that made me want to go back. But in a way that made me pause. Because I realized something I hadn't considered before. Redemption isn't about undoing what happened. It's about what someone does when they can't undo it. And she wasn't trying to. She wasn't asking me to forget. Wasn't trying to convince me that things could go back to how they were. At one point, I said, even if I stayed, it wouldn't be the same. I know, she replied. That was it. No attempt to argue against it. Just acknowledgement. And for some reason, that mattered. Because it meant she understood what was actually broken. Not just the relationship, but the version of it that used to exist. I still didn't trust her. I still questioned things. Still found myself going back to moments, replaying them, trying to understand where everything shifted. That didn't stop. But alongside that, there was something else now. A recognition that she wasn't avoiding the consequences of what she'd done. She was living in them. Day by day. Without trying to escape them. And that left me in a place I didn't expect. Because I wasn't deciding between staying and leaving anymore. I was trying to understand what it meant to move forward, knowing everything I knew. If you've ever been in a situation like this, where someone breaks your trust completely, but then shows up differently afterward, I want to ask you something. Does that change anything for you? Or is the damage already too much, no matter what comes next? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more stories that explore the gray areas of relationships, the ones that don't have easy answers, make sure you subscribe, like the video, and stay with us. Because sometimes, the hardest part isn't deciding what someone else deserves. It's deciding what you're willing to live with. We didn't decide to try again in a single moment. There wasn't a conversation where everything suddenly made sense, or where we both agreed on a clear direction. It happened more gradually than that. One step, then another. At first, it was just, less distance. Longer conversations that didn't end as abruptly. A little more openness. Fewer pauses where neither of us knew what to say next. Still careful. Still measured. But different. I stopped thinking of it as going back. That idea didn't fit anymore. There was nothing to go back to. Whatever we had before, it ended the moment everything came into focus. There was no version of it waiting for us to return. No reset button. And strangely, accepting that made things clearer. Because it meant this wasn't about fixing something broken. It was about deciding whether to build something else, knowing exactly what had already happened. We didn't try to recreate old habits. We didn't pretend things felt normal. If anything, we became more aware of everything. What we said. What we didn't say. How things landed. There was less assumption, more intention. And that changed the way we interacted. Trust still wasn't there. Not fully. I didn't wake up one day feeling secure again. I didn't suddenly stop questioning things or replaying certain moments in my head. That part stayed. But it wasn't the only thing anymore. There was also effort. Consistent, visible effort. Not in big gestures or promises, but in smaller things that repeated over time. The way she showed up. The way she answered, even when the questions were uncomfortable. The way she didn't rush past the tension just to get to something easier. And I met that with something different too. Not blind trust. Not forgiveness in the way people usually think about it. But a willingness to stay present. To not shut down completely. To see what this could become without expecting it to feel the way it used to. That was the hardest part. Letting go of the version of us I had built in my head, and accepting what was actually in front of me. Because this version wasn't lighter. It wasn't effortless. It required awareness in a way we never needed before. But it was honest. More honest than anything we had before. And that honesty came with weight. We both knew what had happened. It wasn't hidden anymore. It wasn't something that could sit quietly in the background. It was part of everything now. Not controlling it, but present. There were still moments where it felt fragile. Where I wondered if this was sustainable, or if we were just delaying something inevitable. I didn't have a clear answer for that. I still don't. But I stopped asking whether things would ever feel the same. Because they won't. And maybe that's the point. This wasn't about getting back what we lost. It was about deciding whether what we could build now was enough to stay. Not better. Not perfect. Just enough. And for now, that was the only question that mattered. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your perspective. Do you believe something real can be rebuilt after trust is broken like this? Or is it always just a different version of something that's already ended? If this story made you think, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's had to face a choice like this. Because not every ending looks like an ending. Sometimes, it looks like starting over, with everything you wish you didn't know.